Good afternoon again to our friends from the media. We have with us at this very moment Mr. Mark Johnson. He is the head of the Asia Pacific Infrastructure Partnership. And just for a backgrounder, the APIP provides a venue for APEC policymakers to discuss issues related to the very important topic of infrastructure development. So they also provide recommendations and suggestions to policymakers across APEC economies on matters related to infrastructure. And then, just to give you an update, the APIP dialogue has just been concluded, and that dialogue or meeting was chaired by Mr. Johnson. So Mr. Johnson can give us the highlights of that meeting, the topics, as well as the objective of that meeting. And then we also have Mr. Guillermo Luz. Of course, we know him. We all know him as the head of the National Competitiveness Council, co-chair of that of the NCC of the Philippines. But he's also wearing a hat for the APEC. He is the representative of the APEC Business Advisory Council. So that is a body under APEC that is represented by business leaders, and they provide suggestions to policymakers on matters concerning the business sector. So we can ask them to give very brief statement, and then afterwards we can open the floor for Q&A. Okay, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's very, very nice place to be. I'd rather be outside, in fact, enjoying it up here, but here we are. I'll give you just a little bit of the history of Asia Pacific Infrastructure Partners, or as we call it, APIP, and what we have been doing here in the Philippines. APIP was established by the ABAC, the APEC Business Advisory Council, because it was seen that the private sector often had very important knowledge in the development of infrastructure, and it's the public sector that often has the responsibility for delivering that infrastructure. And the private sector had knowledge that was not necessarily in the public sector, and so there were inefficiencies in the delivery of infrastructure. Inefficiencies in the way infrastructure projects were put together, inefficiencies in financing, and so on. So APIP has been formed to provide a confidential and frank dialogue between representatives of the business community and the policy makers on the government side to try and reduce what we call information asymmetry, meaning that some people know more than others about various things and so on. And APIP has approximately 100 members from right around the APEC region, with backgrounds in law, finance, engineering, construction, pension fund investing, and so on. And we normally get a group together, in this case it was about 20, to meet with various governments who would like to have that frank and open dialogue. This is the third dialogue that we have had in the Philippines. The first was in 2011, the second was in 2013, and we've just had this current one. And I would say that one of my first and biggest impressions is the great amount of progress that has been made in the Philippines in developing infrastructure projects. When we had our first meeting, there were concerns about financing, how the government got organized, who was responsible for what kinds of contracts should be in place, who needed to give permissions, who would be the regulator, and so on. Very, if I may say so, very sort of nuts and bolts basic issues. But that was the start, really, of this wave of infrastructure development. And we've moved on very, very much from that, because the dialogue today was about the much more complex issues of infrastructure development in an urban environment. How do you develop infrastructure in great big cities? How do you develop it in Metro Manila? How does that complement what goes on in the other regional centres, and so on? And we had, I think, a very, our usual candid discussion. We in APIP got presentations from a number of the key government agencies and government departments. I would say that we were very impressed by the speed with which the planning process has progressed in the Philippines, planning for infrastructure, and we were impressed by the fact that there is now much greater coordination, and issues of implementation between the various agencies and so on are receiving a lot of attention. Like all of these things, the focus is now not so much on the plans, because the plans seem to be very well developed and very well considered. It's how do we overcome some of the more practical obstacles to implementation. In the private sector, we're fairly impatient. We want things to happen, because if they don't happen, we want to go and do something else. But if they do happen, we want it to happen sooner. So we provided our observations which might assist the policymakers in implementing their plans more efficiently and a little more quickly. But those were just observations from the private sector to the policymakers, and I hope they were seen as useful and constructive. So that's, in a long-winded fashion, that's what we did this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now, Mr. Luz.
Thank you. Yeah, we had a busy afternoon, and I do want to thank Mark and welcome Mark back to Manila, or to the Philippines, and now to Tagaytay. No? As Mr. Johnson was saying, this is our third meeting actually of the Asia-Pacific Infrastructure Partnership, which was established by APAC Business Advisory Council a number of years ago. The APIP travels to different APEC economies, meeting one-on-one with each economy, their government and their agencies in charge of infrastructure planning and implementation, and now infrastructure finance. The Philippines was one of the first countries which actually had APIP visit when it got its work underway. So, as he mentioned, it was 2011 and 2013, which we hosted, the private sector hosted in Manila. And then today was the third one, which the government hosted here in Tagaytay as part of the Finance Deputies meeting. I recall, just like Mark, I recall the first meeting, the discussion focused on a lot of basics of PPPs. And I think in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, we had not had a PPP project yet. Fast forward to 2015, just a few years later, we have 9, I believe, in place or about to be awarded, and many more in the pipeline. The value of APIP in a discussion with us in the private sector, and I represent the private sector here together with the government, is that sort of a very free and frank exchange of views of what works and what doesn't work, and the ability to pull on the experience of other countries to see what would be workable solutions for another country. And I think this has been really of great value to us, because we're able to bring in agencies, and the agencies brought in today included NEDA in planning, Department of Energy, Department of Transportation and Communications, Department of Public Works, able to give all their long-range plans, plus inputs from ADB, also on infrastructure projects and their views, and then the comments of the APIP panel. And some, just to give you an idea of some of the suggestions, and types of items which get discussed in the course of a meeting are, one is just stressing the importance of having short and long-term pipelines of projects. Now I think we're getting the picture that from the Philippine agencies, from NEDA, DPWH, DOTC, DOE, we have both that long and short-term pipeline of projects. Now this is important because, as was stressed by APIP, if you have only short-term pipeline, then you kind of necessarily or unnecessarily limit the number of investors interested in setting up, because if the pipeline, why build up a big team if there's not a sufficient pipeline to keep the team interested in investing in projects? So that's a valuable piece of advice, I think, for all of us. No? The second is to take a look at interagency integration of plans. In the beginning, and as we saw also, as they saw in other economies, many agencies plan, but the plans are not integrated. And it's important when different pieces of the infrastructure pie go to different agencies, you have to be able to put them together, whether it's power, roads, ports, water supply, all these things. They need to be coordinated by different ministries. So again, that's something that is looked at. So it's a good way of stepping back, listening to a panel review what kind of potential obstacles there are and how to work through the obstacles. So I think it was a very useful meeting. If I'm not mistaken, I think we're probably maybe the first APEC economy to go through 3 meetings. I'm not sure. But Philippines has always welcomed this partnership with APIP. And we have Philippine members in APIP through Jaime Sobel at Ayala Corporation, and ABAC actually is an ABAC member, so very active in APIP whenever it meets in the Philippines, because we feel there's a value to being able to lean and learn on the advice from this very sort of multinational group of individuals and of institutions and across many professions. Now it's a very multidisciplinary group, and we're happy to have Mark. He's a former member of APEC Business Advisory Council. We also had Yoshihiro Watanabe from Japan, also a member of from Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi, also a former member of the of APEC Business Advisory Council until quite recently, both Mark and Watanabe-san. So it's good to have them still have their presence through APIP advising us on infrastructure. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Luz. We are now opening the floor for questions. For those who want to ask a question, you can just proceed to the mic, state your full name and the organization you belong to. And just a reminder to our media friends, due to time constraints of our resource speakers, we are not allowing ambush interviews after this press conference. So may we suggest that you take this opportunity to ask all the questions that you want from them, to ask to them. Who wants to grab the mic first? Anyone? Okay, Mr. Johnson, I just have to jumpstart this Q&A. So let me throw the first question. Given the fiscal constraints of many economies, how can you expound on alternative means to finance costly but worthy infrastructure projects? And of course, in the Philippines, we have our PPP program. Do you think that is a model that some other economies can learn from?
I think one of the reasons for APIP having dialogues with individual economies is that everyone is at a different stage of development and has different requirements. One of the first dialogues we had was very interesting. It was in Peru. And in Peru, they've got very remote populations, but often there are big mining operations there. And so if they want to build a bridge in that particular territory, they will give the responsibility for building that bridge to the mining company, and the mining company's got to deliver it, and it's got to be certified, and then the mining company will get a tax deduction, essentially, for the cost of that bridge. But that means that the government doesn't have to put its people out there and so on. which was really a very interesting approach. In Mexico, they have a very well-developed system for privatization of roads, and they've got a big toll road authority that administers all the existing toll roads plus the ones to be developed. And I exaggerate a little, but if you're an investor you're the sovereign wealth fund from Qatar or something, and you've got $1 billion that you want to invest in a toll road, they'll almost cut you off. You know, that entitles you to 600 kilometres of toll road, and we'll make one that'll fit your investment proposals. So the economies have individual requirements. Here in the Philippines, as Gil said, in 2011 there wasn't a PPP market, and there wasn't even a structure that was credible for a PPP market. That structure has been put in place. The equity finance has been put in. It's got borrowing capacity, and the structure seems to be working very effectively. The problem is, of course, the menu or the appetite for further developments is huge, and the delivery of good projects into that PPP market, they'll both work with one another to balance, but at the moment the menu of projects which could be financed with PPPs is huge. But the Philippines has made, if I may say so, a much bigger, better, faster start in this area, I think, than many other economies.
Mr. Luz, do you think, as a representative of ABAC, do you think the business sector across the region has enough appetite to participate in PPP projects?
I think there is. No, first of all, the needs are great. Estimates of what the infrastructure requirement will be across APEC or even into a smaller field like East Asia and for the Philippines are huge. No, second is that they're getting bigger mainly because of the force of urbanization. More and more people are moving into cities. There's a greater concentration of people, higher densities in cities, which is placing a lot of pressure on urban infrastructure. But in order to decongest and move people out, you would need that infrastructure to stretch out as well. So to the extent I think that the pipeline gets filled with projects, and to the extent that there's some form of predictability behind the projects, predictability will give, I think, investors a sense of the viability of the projects. And I think in as much as these plans get integrated and they can get that sense of viability, then you will attract. But it's got to be sort of, how shall I say it, for lack of a better word, sort of purposefully planned. If there is no planning and it is just left to the private sector to respond, then they just respond to whatever needs they see and the demand that they see. And if it's not so planned, then no one will make an investment in a particular piece of infrastructure. But if people begin to see that, you know, housing and commercial developments and other sites are built where there's going to, and infrastructure will then be, you know, road infrastructure, transit, mass transit infrastructure will be justified if they see what's at the other end of the line. If there's nothing there, then no one will invest. So that's the importance of having this type of planning. And for the Philippines, it's of greater importance because in practical terms, we have political administrations, governments which go on 3 or 6 year cycles. But if you take a look at the long pipeline of projects, they are anywhere from 10 years to 20 years to 25 years out that you have to look at because you have to make the investment. So let's say it's 25 years. 25 years is essentially 4 administrations, 4 national administrations for the Philippines and 8 local administrations from an LGU point of view. That's really long-range planning. I think the way that works it, is that we have to have some long-term collaboration between a sort of a set of constituents, which are essentially investors and consumers, and a set of sort of career officials who are professional in planning and implementing the projects. And if so long as that's the underlying foundation of these projects, there will be appetite for the projects. Absent that, then I'm not so sure. So we really have to, from our perspective in the Philippines, think long term if we want to keep the interest of investors in these projects.
Thank you. Who wants to grab the mic and ask a question? Anyone?
Maybe they're as tired as we are.
Okay, Jen. Thank you.
That's true. It's a very tough
6 o'clock.
Again, Jenna, please state your full name and your organization just for documentation.
Okay, I'm Jennifer Ambanda from Manila Standard today. Sir, if you would rate the Philippine system of implementing the PPP projects, how would you rate it against the other countries? And in terms of the magnitude of projects that we are building right now, are we at par with, as regards how much the economy is growing? Are we doing enough?
I can just give you some responses from Australia, where the PPP system is very well established and where large new projects are entirely financed by the private sector. For example, we have water shortages in our key capital cities. Both Sydney and Melbourne have built desalination plants which have cost maybe $2.5 billion in each case, and they're entirely financed by the private sector. We also have a model that says that some of the assets owned by the government no longer need to be owned by the government, provided the government undertakes to the voters that it's going to recycle that money into new investment. And for example, in Sydney, in the state of New South Wales, the government has sold the ports to private investors for in excess of $5 or $6 billion. But they're going to take that money and build new road systems and recycle that infrastructure investment, because they bought the ports to maturity. There's no particular public reason why the government should go on owning those ports, provided one thing, and that one thing is that there is a regulatory regime. Ports and all the infrastructure items we're talking about are essentially natural monopolies, and so there's got to be a regulatory regime in which everybody has confidence. Citizens have confidence in it, investors have confidence in it, financiers have confidence in it. And that's one of the things that we discussed at great length back in 2011, but which has either advanced a good way here in the Philippines or is a clearly identified issue. As I understand it, in water in the Philippines, this is not yet established to the satisfaction of everyone. So that's a key element. But so when you get confidence, though, from investors in the regulatory framework, it is possible to do very, very large transactions in public-private partnerships.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Any other question? Okay, Mika.
Good evening. I'm Mika Flores of Business World. Sir, just to follow up to your last statement, how strong and how stable is the regulatory framework or the regulatory regime in the Philippines, and in terms of attracting investors, particularly on infrastructure projects and PPPs? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I don't really have a detailed knowledge of the regulatory system across all the relevant areas in the Philippines. This was identified to us in the presentations in a number of cases, water, for example, and so on. But as an observation from our members, this is a universal requirement. You know, anybody, any economy, anywhere that wants to foster the development of public-private partnerships must have in place regulatory structures to deal with issues of pricing and access, and everybody's got to believe it, that not only does that regulatory authority deal with things competently, but it will continue on to do that over the life of the project. And I think it also needs to be seen to be independent. One of the issues that was raised with us today by a presentation by one of the agencies was that they have concerns have been expressed by the fact that the regulator is still partly the operator, and that is seen to represent a conflict of interest that would probably not be acceptable to private investors.
Any more questions? Okay, should I count 1 to 3 before we end? Okay, may I ask this to Mr. Johnson and Mr. Luz for our closing, for your closing statements. To Mr. Johnson, the APEC 2015 theme is building inclusive economies, building a better world. So how important is the role played by infrastructure in achieving this goal?
Well, infrastructure by its very nature focuses on long life assets that facilitate the movement of people, whether that be ports or marine infrastructure or airports. It's certainly in roads and in public transport, trains, buses, interchanges, and so on. So it seems to me that it's actually an essential, I don't know whether it's the bones or the sinews of inclusiveness. If you want a more inclusive economy, people have got to be able to make use of that. They've got to be able to move around, they've got to be able to do their business, they've got to be able to have much greater mobility physically, and with physical mobility comes mental mobility as well, I think. So it's an absolute precondition of moving forward, I think, in social inclusiveness.
Thank you. Mr. Luz, besides your role in ABAC, you're also the private sector co-chair of NCC. So how do you think the Philippines hosting of APEC meetings for 2015 is complementing our goal for competitiveness?
Well, you know, I've always felt it's important to be able to host APEC, and I've been fortunate, been lucky enough to be involved in the first round in '96 and then this current round. And the advantages, I guess, of it is that you're able to work with a large number of economies, 20 other parties, no, to be able to discuss issues like infrastructure and infrastructure finance, which will push development and growth. And that development and growth is not only for the region, but obviously for the country as well. And I think it's important for us to participate in this discussion and to get involved in the plans and programs that begins to integrate. Just to also refer back to your first question to Mr. Johnson, which is about inclusive growth and building a better world. a key ingredient of inclusive growth or inclusive development is connectivity. You can't have connectivity without infrastructure. We're going to need some form of connectivity across many fronts. Now, there's, of course, there's physical connectivity. There's also sort of digital and telecommunications connectivity as well that we need, because the world has changed. It's not just about the movement of goods and the movement of people, but it's actually the performance of services as well. And so the ability to host APEC and to begin to concentrate on all these issues, which are important for us developmentally, as they are for the region, is a great opportunity for the Philippines. And when you think of APEC as, 40% of the world's population, but over half of the world's of global GDP, and about half of global trade, then APEC is kind of punching above its weight. And I think it's because of that connectivity and that strategy of linking together and having trade facilitation and liberalized trade. So this is an important aspect for us to be able to get involved in the Philippines. But on a more practical side, I think distributing the meetings across many locations, and Tagaytay is a great example. If we hadn't hosted the meeting here, it's not likely that Mr. Johnson and many others would come to Tagaytay to see Tagaytay, and probably would not even be aware that a place like Tagaytay exists. So I'm happy that when we take a look at the APEC hosting for the year, we've been able to make the rounds. We've done Clark and Subic. In fact, the first Finance Dep SOM meeting was in Clark in January 2021, and then the SOM meetings, and then now we're here in Tagaytay. It's going to move to Bataan. We're looking at meetings in Iloilo and Bacolod and Cebu and Boracay for the other ministerial meetings and the other senior official meetings. So I think if we hadn't planned it this way, then there's really no opportunity to showcase the country and the culture and the sites. So I think this is a great opportunity as well, and one of the, I guess you would call it, the advantages or the benefits of hosting APEC. So I'm happy that we're all here in Tagaytay and get out of Metro Manila, get out from the crowds and get away to a more relaxing place. In fact, the frustration actually is that you get stuck in a meeting in a room with no windows, knowing that the sun is shining outside and we're unable to get out there in the sun. So, but that's the nature of the work. We have to get to the work, but it's a great advantage to be able to bring people around.
Okay, thank you very much. On that note, we are closing this press conference. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Enjoy the rest of the day.